In the summer of 1920, a financial fever gripped Boston. Thousands of people, from factory workers to police officers, lined up on School Street to give their life savings to one man. He promised them a staggering 50% profit in just 45 days. And for a while, he delivered. That man was Charles Ponzi. His name would become a synonym for the very fraud he perfected. But the popular image of Ponzi as a criminal mastermind misses the real story. His own publicist would later call him a financial idiot who could barely add. The truth is more unsettling. Charles Ponzi didn't need to be a genius. He just needed to find the holes in a financial system that was utterly unprepared for him. This is the story of how institutional failure, not a brilliant fraudster, created one of history's most infamous swindles. It's the story of a system that wasn't just broken. In many ways, it didn't even exist yet. The America of the Roaring Twenties was a place of wild optimism. The stock market was soaring, and many believed anyone could get rich. But beneath that surface, the nation's financial system was dangerously unregulated. Today, we take oversight for granted. We have the SEC to police markets and the FDIC to ensure bank deposits. In 1920, none of that existed. The idea of a powerful federal regulator was a lesson that would only be learned after the Great Depression. The SEC wouldn't be created until 1934. Instead, a messy patchwork of state-level blue-sky laws were the only defense. These were meant to stop the sale of worthless investments, literally pieces of the blue sky, but they were weak and fundamentally unequipped for a national economy. The laws created a jurisdictional trap. A fraudster operating in one state could use the Federal Postal Service to mail solicitations to victims in another. State B's regulators had no authority over a person in State A, and State A's regulators had no jurisdiction over a crime affecting residents of State B. The system was paralyzed because no single agency had the authority to connect the dots across state lines. This regulatory vacuum was amplified by the culture of the era. In a time of such explosive growth, aggressive optimism often crowded out skepticism. The public had been conditioned to believe in individual success stories, and questioning a high-return opportunity could be seen as cynical or unsophisticated. The banking system was just as shaky. The U.S. had over 30,000 banks, many of them small and operating with little oversight. With no federal deposit insurance, a bank failure meant you lost everything. Between 1920 and 1929, over 5,000 banks shut their doors for good. This was a system built almost entirely on trust, not by choice, but by necessity. It was optimized for speed and growth in a rapidly industrializing nation. Verification is slow. It creates friction and paperwork that can hinder expansion. For decades, this high-trust, low-verification model worked more or less. Banks had no legal duty to question the source of massive deposits. Companies had no obligation to disclose their financial health. The work fell entirely on the individual investor, who had no power to demand proof. The system assumed honesty because it had no effective way to punish dishonesty on a grand scale. Into this world, a world practically begging to be exploited, walked Charles Ponzi. Charles Ponzi was not a sophisticated financier. Born in Italy, he arrived in America in 1903 with a casual relationship with the law. His early career consisted of odd jobs and petty crime. In Montreal, he worked at a bank that was essentially an early Ponzi scheme, and after it collapsed, he was caught forging a check and spent 3 years in prison. By 1919, he was 37, with a criminal record and a string of failed businesses. The idea that made him famous came in a letter containing an international reply coupon, or IRC. An IRC let someone prepay for return postage on an international letter. The recipient could swap the coupon for local stamps. Ponzi noticed that post-war inflation had created a price difference, An IRC bought cheap in a country with a weak currency could be exchanged for more valuable stamps in the U.S. This was a form of arbitrage. Buy coupons in Europe, swap them for U.S. stamps, and sell the stamps for a profit. Ponzi claimed the returns could top 400%. The only problem? The scheme was logistically and mathematically impossible. First, the scale was a fantasy. To cover the millions he was taking in, one journalist calculated Ponzi would have needed 160 million IRCs. The actual number of IRCs in the entire world was only about 27,000. Second, you couldn't exchange IRCs for cash, only for stamps. Turning a literal mountain of postage stamps into millions of dollars to pay investors would have been a logistical nightmare, wiping out any theoretical profit. The IRC arbitrage was never the business. It was just the story. The real business was simple. Use money from new investors to pay off the early ones. Early investors got paid, creating a chorus of success stories that drowned out any doubt. In a system that didn't ask for verification, the appearance of a brilliant idea was all he needed. The impossibility of the scheme didn't matter, because the social proof it generated was more powerful than any private calculation. Each new investor who got paid became a walking advertisement, creating a feedback loop where trust in the crowd completely replaced the need for an audit. Charles Ponzi was the architect, but he didn't build his scheme alone. At every step, the financial and civic institutions of Boston became his unwitting accomplices. The first failure was the banks. Ponzi funneled millions into the Hanover Trust Company, a small Boston bank. The bank asked no questions. Instead, it saw Ponzi as its star client. For a small institution, his massive deposits were a miracle. On its balance sheet, his millions appeared as assets, massively inflating the bank's perceived capital reserves. This made the bank look robust and stable, which in turn attracted more legitimate depositors. The bank's leadership had a direct incentive not to investigate the source of the funds, as doing so would risk scaring off their golden goose. Ponzi soon bought a controlling interest, gaining a seat on the board. The bank that should have been a guardrail was now his personal piggy bank and a source of legitimacy. The press, far from being a watchdog, was initially his greatest cheerleader. On July 24, 1920, the Boston Post ran a glowing front-page story that simply repeated Ponzi's claims. The effect was electric. He was soon raking in a reported $250,000 a day. Government authorities were paralyzed, as no single agency had clear authority to investigate his finances. The beginning of the end came from the Boston Post itself. After its fawning article, the publisher grew nervous and asked respected financial journalist Clarence Barron to analyze the scheme. Barron's conclusion was brutal. It was impossible. His article sent a tremor of doubt through the city. Scrambling to control the narrative, Ponzi hired a publicist, William McMasters, who quickly realized he was working for a fraud. McMasters took his proof to the Post, which on August 2nd published his exposé under a massive headline declaring Ponzi was millions in debt. A panic began. In a brilliant display of showmanship, Ponzi paid out nearly $2 million in 3 days, momentarily calming the crowds. He agreed to stop taking new deposits during a government audit, a decision that proved fatal. By cutting off his supply of new money, he sealed his fate. The cash flow stopped, and the scheme imploded. On August 12, 1920, after the Post revealed his prior criminal record, Charles Ponzi surrendered to federal authorities. He wasn't brought down by a brilliant detective. He was brought down by simple math. The aftermath was devastating. Investors lost around $20 million, the equivalent of over $300 million today. The collapse triggered a banking crisis, causing Hanover Trust and 5 other banks to fail. Ponzi was convicted of mail fraud, sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and was eventually deported in 1934, dying broke years later. For its role in exposing him, the Boston Post won a Pulitzer Prize. But Ponzi's real legacy was the chilling realization of how vulnerable the American financial system was. The public outrage fueled a demand for massive reform, especially after the stock market crash of 1929 amplified the same systemic weaknesses on a global scale. Congress responded with a landmark series of laws, the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. They were built on two principles. Companies must tell the public the truth, and brokers must treat investors fairly. To enforce this, the 1934 Act created the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. The ghost of Charles Ponzi haunted the halls where those laws were written. These new rules were a direct reaction to the problems of the 1920s, a lack of mandatory disclosure and no federal oversight. However, regulation is an inherently reactive process. It is a map of past failures. The SEC was an excellent solution to the specific vulnerabilities that Ponzi and the 1929 crash had exposed, but it could not solve the core problem. Financial innovation will always outpace regulatory understanding. The fundamental weakness is not a specific missing rule, but the permanent gap between the speed of invention and the speed of oversight. The story of Charles Ponzi is a powerful reminder of how easily systems can fail. It's why understanding financial history is so vital for anyone navigating the markets today. If you want to hear more stories that pull back the curtain on our financial world, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. In the end, Charles Ponzi wasn't a mastermind. He was a symptom. He stumbled upon a gaping hole in the fabric of American finance and walked right through it. The system failed because authority was splintered and there were no rules demanding transparency. It failed because trust in a charismatic man, in the press, in the banks, had completely replaced the hard work of verification. The laws that followed were an attempt to build a system that was skeptical by design, one that runs on the principle of trust but verify. And yet, the Ponzi pattern never really goes away. Every time a new, complex, and unregulated financial frontier emerges, new versions of this story play out. The technology changes, but the core vulnerability is the same. Fraud thrives where rules are fuzzy and oversight is weak. Ponzi's story isn't just history, it's a permanent warning.